Hi, and welcome to the third presentation for Week 3 in IS-286. In the last two presentations, we completed a basic OSPF configuration, and then we reviewed that configuration. Now in this presentation, we are going to expand on our OSPF configuration to include another OSPF area. For this presentation, I have taken the network topology that was used in the first two presentations and just simply added to it. What I added are the two routers that you see over here on the right hand side of my network topology. These two routers and their connected networks are going to be in Area 1. Okay, so while the original network segment over here will remain in Area 0. As I start the OSPF configuration, let me point out that the OSPF configuration that was completed in the first presentation for Week 3 is still intact. So, the original network segment has a complete basic OSPF configuration that is fully functional. In other words, there is OSPF routing between all parts of the original network segment. Okay, so now let's begin our configuration of the new network segment, which is predominantly OSPF Area 1. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is to configure our interfaces. We'll start with router 3. Okay, so the first thing that I will do is issue the show IP interface brief command in order to see what interfaces this router has. As you can see here, we have two serial interfaces and two Ethernet interfaces. So we know that both serial interfaces are in use, and we know that we are only using one of the Ethernet interfaces. We can tell that by looking at our topology. At this point, we would need to either physically look at the router in order to see which interfaces are in use, or more likely just look at our network documentation. Okay, so looking at my topology, I can see that serial 000 on router 3 is connected to serial 001 on router 2. Now, since this serial interface on router 2 was not in use before the addition of Area 1, I will need to configure an IP address there as well. Okay, so first let me go ahead and configure serial 000 on router 3. Okay, so I'll need to go into global configuration mode. And then I'll go into the interface itself. Okay, and for serial connections, I'm going to continue to use /30 subnets that start out with 10.1. So for this point-to-point serial connection, I'll use the 10.1.2.0/30 network. I'll give .1 to router 2 and .2 to router 3. Okay, and remember, we must use the no shutdown command in order to bring the interface up administratively. Okay, so now let's give dot 1 to the other interface, the one on router 2. Okay, so it looks like our interface came up there. We're seeing the system messages, but let's go ahead and ping across this connection to make sure everything is working properly. Okay, and our pings are successful. Okay, so now I'm going to configure the one remaining point-to-point serial connection over here, and I'll use the 10.1.3.0/30 for this network. I'll first configure dot 1 on router 3's interface, and then dot 2 on router 4's interface. Okay, so now at this point I just need to configure the Ethernet interfaces on router 3 and router 4. And we can see, according to our network diagram there, we're using 192.168.4.0 for the network connected to router 3, and then 5.0 for the other network. and that's a 24-bit mask. Okay, so all of our interfaces are now configured. Okay, so now it's time to configure our multi-area OSPF. Okay, so we'll start out on router 2, but remember, we only have OSPF turned on for the 10.1.4.0/30 and 192.168.2.0/24 networks. Okay, so that is on router 2 because those were the existing networks. So we need to turn on OSPF for network 10.1.2.0. Okay, but first I need to decide, do I want router 2 to be my area border router or router 3? Since the routers are identical, I'm just going to pick one and use router 3 over here as my area border router. Okay, so that means that router 2 will be an internal router to area 0. Okay, so I need to go ahead and configure OSPF for network 10.1.2.0/30. Okay, so that's it there for router 2. Okay, so now we need to go to let's see, hold on. Okay, hold on. Before we do that, let's just take a look at something real quick here. Let's look at our OSPF status by looking at the show IP protocol command. And of course, if I'm going to do it from here, I have to put do in front of it. Okay, and I just wanted to look here to make sure, okay, everything looks good. Our network that we just started advertising is there. So, okay, so that looks great. Okay, so now we need to go over to router 3 and configure OSPF for its directly connected networks. Now keep in mind the connection to router 2 is in area 0, but all other connections here that we're going to be configuring are in area 1. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is use the show IP interface brief command so that I can see all the directly connected networks again here on router 3. And then I'll just configure OSPF for those networks, being sure not to forget that only one of these will go into area 0. Okay, so now that OSPF is configured for all networks on router 3, let's take a look at the results here. First, we'll look at the output from the show IP protocols command. Notice that we have one network that's in area 0. Okay, and then we have two networks that are in area 1. Okay, so at this point, this router is now an area border router, and we can see that because it has networks in multiple areas. Okay, so at this point we have the beginning of our multi-area OSPF configuration. So next, let's look at the routing table for router 3 and compare that to the routing table for router 2. Okay, notice router 3 has all of the routes for area 0. Okay, and at this point everything in area 1 is showing up as directly connected. And that's because we've not configured OSPF on router 4 yet. Okay, so however, let's go ahead and see what router 2's routing table looks like. Okay, notice here that we now have two IA or intra-area routes, and these routes are for networks in area 1. Okay, so notice the difference in how those show up there. Okay, so at this point all that's left is to configure OSPF on router 4. So I'll go to router 4 and configure OSPF for networks 10.1.3.0 and 192.168.5.0. Okay, so at this point we've got OSPF fully configured. So let's go back and take a look at router 2's routing table again. Okay, and we should now see one more inter-area route, and we do. We have 3 here now, because remember it already knew about 10.1.3, and it already knew about 192.168.4. Okay, so here's our new intra-area route that is showing up there. Okay, well, that's essentially it for our multi-area OSPF configuration. As you can see, there's really nothing special about configuring multi-area OSPF as compared to single area OSPF. Really, the challenge comes into play when you're trying to create a proper design for a network that's obviously going to be more advanced and more complicated than what we were dealing with here in this example. Okay, so Again, the key here is just to make sure that you put each network in the correct area when completing your OSPF network statements. Okay, so this concludes the third presentation for week 3 in IS 286.